Old people have read it. What were the back in my day things your old people told you about back in the day? Story 1. My grandma told us about my great-great-grandpa leaving his family farm at the age of 11 because he didn't get along with his dad. He traveled around working on farms until he met my great-great-grandmother, who was the daughter of a farm owner, and they ran away together at 16. Story 2. My grandpa was born premature. The doctor said to let him die. His mom put him in a shoebox under the wood stove as sort of an incubation thing, which of course, worked. He lived to be 89. My dad was locked out of the house in high school. So he went into the garage, found a random key, grabbed my grandfather's woodworking file, and carved a new front door key for the house based off of memory. What the duck? Who can do something like that? Story 3. My great-grandmother told me stories about her family traveling from Ohio to Arkansas by wagon and on a Mississippi River ferry. It was her father and mother and 8 children, all girls. Story 4. My great-grandmother's name was chosen when her mother wrote to her mother-in-law in Scotland asking what to name the new baby. Of all the lovely Scottish names in existence, Mother McQuiston suggested Mabel. So that was my great-grandmother's name. When she was a little girl, great-grandmother received a gift of a doll with a porcelain head. She described it as the prettiest thing she ever owned. She owned many lovely things throughout her life, but she said that doll was most precious to her. Her sister broke its head by dropping it on the marble top of a dresser, and she said she cried for days. My mother has a collection of about 8 dolls passed down from great-grandmother. She never threw anything away. My great-grandmother was born in 1893 and saw the age of technology boom from the Model T Ford to the space shuttle. Of all the inventions in modern times, I think she was most impressed with Scotch tape. There was nothing she wouldn't try to fix with Scotch tape. My mother still has a pull toy originally given to my grandmother. It's a wooden horse and buggy, and the poor horse's tail fell off sometime in the 1950s, but it's been reattached many times in the last 70 years, always with Scotch tape. Story 5. One great-uncle talked about his childhood in the state orphanage. Another talked about liberating French wine cellars during World War II. My grandpa would talk about blazing trails for roads and building bridges and dams throughout the state. My grandma talked about keeping her preemie twin siblings alive by putting them in the wood-burning stove overnight. Story 6. My great-grandma was born in 1914 to a Native American woman and an Anglo man. She would tell stories of washing clothes in the river as a kid, and making all of her own toys, with the help of her 11 siblings, out of fabric, clay and wood. Her favorite thing was bells. The first time she saw a hand bell, she was 20 years old. Her house was full of bells of all shapes, sizes and materials. She had several valuable possessions, but her most cherished was the bell her husband gifted her on their wedding night. He jokingly told her to ring it any time she needed his help. After he passed, she would ring it any time she needed a jar open, or something small fixed. She'd try herself, unsuccessfully, ring the bell, and try again. She swore he was the one opening all the stuck jars. Story 7. My grandmother grew up during the Depression and talks about raising rabbits to butcher. Her mother would can the rabbit meat after her father skinned them to sell the fur to the army. She says skinned rabbits look like dead babies because the ears come off when you skin them. Her mother also made clothing out of potato sacks and wouldn't teach any of the kids to sew because she didn't want them to mess up and end up wasting material. She likewise wouldn't teach them to cook in case of messing it up and wasting food. There was a much bigger divide between religions at the time, too. She and her family were Protestant, and her best friend in school was Catholic. She walked to school every day with that friend. But on Sundays, when walking to their respective churches, the friend would walk on the opposite side of the road and wouldn't acknowledge or speak to her. One day, one of the Catholic boys showed up at the Protestant church just to listen to a service and completely blew everyone's minds by being curious. He only came the one time and they let him sit in, but it was unheard of at the time. Later, when my grandmother met my Catholic grandfather, the Catholic priest in my grandfather's church was going to refuse to marry them. Grandma had to strike a bargain with the bishop of the area and agree to raise any potential children as Catholic if she wouldn't convert to Catholicism herself in order for them to be married, or the bishop would have excommunicated my grandfather for marrying a Protestant. In the end, my grandfather was allowed to remain in the church and marry my grandmother, but the priest wouldn't allow them to stand on the altar during the ceremony and they had to stand in front of it. Story 8. I am only in my late 30s, but my father was 50 when I was born, and he was born in the 1930s. The biggest back in my day thing for him would be friendliness. When he moved to a new neighborhood, one of the first things he always would do is go around and introduce himself to all his neighbors. In 2020, you are more likely to get the stink eye from the new neighbors as you haul your shit into your new place. He also lived most of his life boarding with others. He had money, he had a fantastic career and made great money for most of his life. From his time in college until meeting my mom in the very late 70s though, he'd rent a room from a family with a room to let and live with them. That's fairly uncommon now, although for single men that was pretty normal then. He was the worst nightmare of every European, I think. He'd try to talk to you and get to know everyone he could, even in the checkout line of the grocery store. The definition of the overly talkative, loud, annoying American. For him it was normal to want to know everyone. The upside? He had friends everywhere. There are some funny stories of him traveling in Japan in the early 80s, doing his usual thing, and having some serious cultural clash. Story 9. I'm in my 30s, so not an old person. But my grandmother grew up during the Depression, and steak was a luxury for their family as they had little money. My great-grandmother, Mamu, had a gentleman friend over one night for dinner and told her children to behave as if they had steak all the time, as she had bought steak to cook to appear more wealthy. At the dinner table, with the guest, when the steak was served, the three kids chanted, "We have it every day. We have it every day." I still get a laugh from this story. Steak was such a treat back then, she would say. Story 10. The fish back in the day were huge and plentiful. My grandpa showed me pictures of the redfish he caught over the years. You can clearly see as the decades go on they get smaller and smaller until the 90s when they put strict commercial fishing rules in, and then they got a little bigger. Never anywhere close to the 50s though. Story 11. My grandma, not really, but she babysat us when we were kids, grew up in Hazard, Kentucky in what must have been the 20s and 30s. She'd tell us stories like the time she broke her arm as a kid after falling off a horse, and her brother set it out in the field, no further medical treatment. Her younger sister, 3 or so, was eaten by the family pigs. My dad always said we should record or write down some of her stories, and I really wish I had. Story 12. My grandmother would talk at times about how amazing it was watching TV. The entire neighborhood would go over to one family's house to watch I Love Lucy and Dragnet. Just weird to think about just one set on the whole block. My great-grandfather talked about watching Babe Ruth play and talked about how sports in general evolved over the decades. Everything from lowering the pitching mound in the MLB to the change in helmets for the NFL. Story 13. My dad would tell me back in the day he would get in a lot of fights because he is married to a black woman. He would go to the black areas and they would say, "What are you doing with one of our women?" He would go to the white areas and they would say, "What are you doing with a black woman?" Very hard on my parents at the time. And they both was shunned from the family on both sides. Story 14. I am 65 and my dad is 99, born in 1921. He has lived through and been shaped by things that fill history books. He has seen hardships and horrors that are unimaginable to the modern mind. He had a ship sink out from under him when it collided with another ship doing zigzags, pitch black night, submarine avoidance. He has been strafed by a Mitsubishi Zero and owned a Mitsubishi Gallant. He has plowed a field with a mule. He was once injured in a train wreck. My dad has watched the world evolve from Charlie Chaplin to CGI Taco Bell commercials. The technology advances are something older people often take in stride and he is no exception. They don't embrace all of it, unless it is practical to them. Where he is often lost is dealing with a strange and alien world that in almost no way resembles the world of his youth. Streaming TV? He doesn't get the universal applicability. Want a new pair of shoes? Go to Sears. The overwhelming choices in every grocery store in America often causes him visible distress. To me there is not enough in the world to choose from. To him there is an overabundance of everything that becomes an incomprehensible white noise. Their world was smaller with less of everything. This sounds awful to me, but they understood and accepted it. Story 15. My grandpa spoke of his role on Juno Beach on D-Day. He went on to the Battle of Carpi Cay where he hid in a field and acted as a sniper. He told me how he couldn't move for a few days, he couldn't even scratch an itch or he might get shot. That amazed me as a kid. I never forgot that little tidbit and it still sticks with me to this day, how every time I try not to scratch an itch, I remember my grandpa who couldn't even if he'd wanted to. I never last, and always have to scratch the itch. My grandpa was the best. Story 16. My grandfather talked about sodbusters in his farming community. I think it means people plowing a field for the first time ever. He remembered getting his first tractor, and how everything was done with draft horses before that. In the 2000s, before he passed, he remembered the Great Ice Storm of 1922 like it was last year. Story 17. My grandfather used to tell the story of how when he was a young man in the 1950s he'd help out at his grandfather's farm. My great-great-grandfather was born in the late 1870s, so he was already an adult the first time he saw things like electric lights, cars, and aircraft. The old man was generally amazed at the pace at which technology was progressing in the 20th century. As the two men were working on the farm, a fighter jet flew by at a low altitude and they both stopped what they were doing to just stare at this brand new piece of technology. It was the first time either of them had seen a jet. The old man was clearly amazed at what he saw, then he just shook his head and jokingly said, "Ha. I'll bet they'll try flying to the moon any day now." As though such a feat would be so utterly impossible that even considering trying to accomplish it would be sheer idiocy. The old man sadly died before the first moon landing, but amazingly he lived long enough to read about Yuri Gagarin flying to space. Story 18. My pawpaw and Meemaw would talk to me about how every single day, no matter what they were doing, they got dressed. Meemaw wore a house dress and had her hair done. Pawpaw was wearing a white cotton button-up, belt, pants, and hair styled even when working outside. I see many folks from their generation in my neighborhood. I live in an area of retired folks, and they'll be out gardening in the hot southern sun, with a belt, pants, button-up, but tennis shoes now on. Lol, I try to have a similar habit at home. I think it was a polite and sweet thing for them to try to look nice for each other and themselves. Story 19. Walking home from work most days to save the nickel or dime the streetcar would cost during the Great Depression. Baking cakes with half the amount of sugar the recipe called for because it was rationed during World War II. Walking inside 5, 10, or 15 different offices in a single day looking for secretarial work even if you could type 90 words a minute and take shorthand. Story 20. I don't qualify for this necessarily, but the story is too good not to tell. My dad, 64 now, used to tell me about my great-grandfather poaching in Algonquin Park during the winter to survive. He used to only move during snowstorms and wear his snowshoes backwards to avoid being caught. Fascinates me to this day, going to camp in and around the same lakes he hunted at back then. My Irish great-grandmother also taught him how to read and write. Crazy to think that wasn't a common skill the way it is today. Story 21. Grandmother Ruby told me months before her death, the greatest thing that happened to her and women was cars. She and her husband Henry homesteaded a huge tract of land in the Dakotas and were so isolated it was oppressive and lonely. After they got a car, going to town was thrilling and something they could do often because they didn't have to hitch horses to a carriage and slowly plod to it. 8 months after I visited Ruby, she was found outside her home deceased. She was 92 and had fallen down while taking a late night walk. God bless you, Grandmother Ruby, you're still an inspiration to me. Story 22. My dad sometimes remembers stories his grandmother used to tell him about her life on a farmstead during the era of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some of them are pretty interesting and really show how quickly the world has changed. She always mentioned that the decree for their land was signed by Emperor Franz Joseph I, and they had farm hands/servants from different cerners of the empire working on their farm. Her grandmother used to sneak her hard-boiled chicken eggs under the pillow at night as a treat. Although they were well off as farmers, they had to pay a tax to the empire in goods, animals, farm products, etc. So a small thing like a chicken egg was a luxury for them. They traded their goods across the empire, and covered their trading routes by foot/horse carriage. Apparently, they covered up to 400 kilometers, 250 miles, this way, which took them a month or so to get from their village in northern Slovakia to towns in Austria. Story 23. My great-great-aunt is pushing 100. The last time I saw her, she was talking about how she went on this game show in Pittsburgh sometime in the 40s and won an art set, art lessons, and a gas-powered lawnmower. Apparently, it was the first gas mower in the entire town and everyone was amazed. As for those art lessons, she used those supplies to make a name for herself in the area. 80 years later, she still paints daily, teaches occasionally, and sells more than a few. Story 24. My 44 meters grandmother, born in 1920, was a badass attorney who put herself through college and law school while raising 4 kids on her own. One holiday she was watching my niece and nephew when my sister couldn't get a sitter and told them I used to lock your grandma and her brothers and sister in a room with a padlock when I needed to go out. But it's okay, I left them cookies. Story 25. Granddad talking about listening to veterans of the American Civil War discuss their experiences. Grandmother talking about folding up the wrappers from sticks of butter at her job and taking them home to scrape off the butter so my dad and his brother could have butter on their biscuits in the morning during the Depression. And all of them had a story about when they heard about Pearl Harbor. Story 26. My dad was born in 1924, in the Bronx, NY. He told me he had an uncle who was murdered by the mafia during Prohibition. He also told me that as a young man, teens or 20s, he got into a fistfight with Tony Curtis. Back then his name was Bernie Schwartz. According to my dad, he kicked Bernie's ass. He also told me more mundane things, like when he was little they would get ice for the icebox every morning from a horse-drawn wagon. Story 27. My grandfather, born in 1932, said that his dad lost his job in 1939 and could no longer afford the home they lived in, so they rounded up their 5 kids and left everything in that house and drove until they saw an abandoned house in a field. They made it their home for a few months. No electricity, no water, and the house was falling apart. They found another home once my great-grandfather found work. They never moved back to their original home and he never knew what happened to it afterwards. Story 28. My granddad told me once that his grandfather complained about how the Union troops destroyed their land. He fought for the Confederate Army and resented what the Union troops did to the land and people who had no involvement in the war and didn't care about the purpose of the war. He is buried with other Confederate soldiers in Mississippi. Before anyone thinks bad about my family, no, my granddad and dad are not racist in any way, shape, or form and fought segregation through the church using scripture to validate their point that Jesus came to save everyone and we are commanded to love everyone. Story 29. My dad was born in 1913, I'm 59. His grandfather was a major influence on him as a child. My great-grandfather traveled by ship across the Atlantic at least 5 times before returning to his homeland of Tyrol in the early 1930s. His family stayed in the US after he started multiple successful businesses. My dad visited him in Tyrol in 1938 and was the last of the family to visit before he died during the war, but not due to it, as far as I know. When my dad's ship entered the harbor at Naples, there was a message distributed to passengers to be on the deck at a particular time as Hitler and Mussolini were meeting in the harbor for some reason. I have the ship's message announcement. They were still statesmen and not villains, so it was a big deal. I'm still stunned when I consider the differences between mine and my dad's life at a comparable age. Story 30. I was born in the 90s and back in my day we would have cassette tapes and we rewind them with a pencil. After that we had a Walkman. When I was in my teens, MP3 players. Next I saw the transition to mobile phones and everyone had the meme Nokia 3310 until flip phones became a thing. After that Blackberries and iPhones started the smartphone revolution. We had these old CRT monitors and transistor TVs that were replaced by plasma around my teens and LCD later. Video games were crude and sometimes unfair. The AVGN is basically a time capsule for these things. There is a weird nostalgia for these unfair games, hence popularity of Souls games and roguelikes now. I saw the revolution of online gaming and esports, something I used to dream of as a kid. I saw the transition to the Euro and internet culture that used to be more crappy in terms of UI and content was more wild west like. I witnessed the transition from pre to post 9/11 and was old enough to remember it. The climate used to be different here too, but it became hotter overall. We had like this tradition to Elfstedentocht, where when a big river froze over we used to skate in midwinter to 11 towns. I saw the last one as a child on TV. My grandma told me that there used to be only one person in the street that had a car. People didn't have TVs, she would go out on Wednesdays to their only neighbor with a TV without a remote to watch with all the kids in the neighborhood. She used to tell me there was not always programming and the TVs had test image for sales. Can you believe it, like literally nothing but test image being broadcast, no programming, nothing. She used to sleep in a closet as a kid and they had to share the bathwater with their 9 siblings, youngest her going last. She told me about candy costing 5 cents and her being able to buy a house with my grandpa who was a carpenter and earned 80 guldens a month, being able to afford a 3-story house. She had one photo as a kid she bought for 20 when a photographer passed by. Now we have smartphones with cameras everywhere. I would argue technological gain has been so fast that in my near 30s I have a similar culture shock to my grandma with my sister who is about 10 years younger. It's insane how fast we went in less than 70-ish years.